Hi, everyone. My name is Kyle Paul, and welcome to Between the Brackets. This month on our show, I am joined by Hillary Richardson, who is an attorney on Google's open source licensing team. I'm very excited to have her here. And so what we'll be talking about today is open source licensing. So make sure to have your questions prepared. You can go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we will answer them live while we're having our conversation. So make sure to have your questions prepped and ready to go. We will also be sharing some fun links and stuff like that. So be sure to have some research. If you aren't subscribed already, go ahead and subscribe. You can learn more about our previous episodes by visiting the link on screen. And with that, I would like to welcome Hillary on stage. Welcome, Hillary.
Hi.
Hi, how's it going?
Great. It's good to be here. Always happy to talk about open source licensing.
Definitely. Go ahead and I know I kind of introduced you as working on our Google open source team. Do you want to give us a little bit more background on what it is that you do at Google and some of the fun, interesting projects that you've worked on?
Oh, definitely. So I've been at Google for almost 4 years now, working on open source licensing, compliance strategy, and supporting our open source foundation collaborations. So that means I get to work with a lot of product teams around Google, and I get a lot of insight into fun stuff people are working on. And I think it's also kind of a fun role because a lot of the times practicing law can be very adversarial. You're always kind of up against each other. And open source is really facilitating collaboration in a very friendly, open way where people are really, I think at the end of the day, trying to be fair to each other, trying to make sure that there's open, transparent access. And it's just a very different flavor of looking at how people can come together, both outside the company and at Google, figuring out how to use things, how to share things, how to contribute to things. And it's just a very different focus.
Definitely. And for those of you tuning in, if you haven't already, we do have an open source security talk that we did 2 weeks ago. So which we did cover some of those more interesting ways of using your open source licenses to protect yourself. We're not necessarily going to be diving into that too much today, but kind of covering, and this is for you, Hillary, why are open source licenses so revolutionary? Like why, we talked about open source, so the idea of being open and, you mentioned collaboration. So there's that basis on what open source is, but why do we need licenses? What are they for?
Yeah, great question, and very fundamental really to open source, because open source at the end of the day is defined by the licenses. I think a lot of people have the sense of open source meaning public collaboration, and I have friends who go, Hillary, why are you working on on legal stuff for open source? If it's on the internet, can't you just use it? And it's a very commonly held understanding. But the thing is that copyright is exclusive to an author until it's licensed out. It's a bundle of rights, the right to copy, the right to make derivative works, the right to publish and display, all those things. So all the fun things that you want to do with code, you don't necessarily have any permission to do those unless the author puts a license on the code. And that can be a little scary thinking about, wait, what about GitHub? Like 70% of the code doesn't even have a license. But once it has an open source license, then you have clarity about what you're allowed to do. So open source comes from the open source definition, which was created about 20 years ago now. So people kind of take it a little bit for granted sometimes, but that's what open source means. It means that it has a license that fits the open source definition. So that's a set of principles, and some of those are really preserving the ability for other people to copy, modify, distribute, sublicense. And those sound like boring words, but it's actually very exciting because that means that you can copy it onto your workstation, you can, patch it, you can share it, you can decide, I want to make my own version of this. And what's really revolutionary with this, the same way that, Creative Commons licenses have facilitated this unheard of scale of collaboration on Wikipedia, for code, it used to be under traditional copyright regimes, you have to go to the copyright author, you have to negotiate a license, you have to make sure that those exclusive permissions are licensed out. With this open source license regime, it's like other licenses where you set the terms and then everyone else knows what to use. And the funny thing about open source is that some of the earlier, most popular licenses were drafted not by attorneys as much as by engineers, but some of them, there's some value in let's say the MIT and the BSD license. They're so short, and that's part of how they're so successful, is they're easier to read and understand that way. And there is a lot of power in that. Other open source licenses like the Apache license were written by attorneys, but basically what it means is that instead of everyone having to find the first person who wrote a piece of code or everyone who's contributed and asking for permission directly, everyone agrees up front, you can use this as long as you do this. So do this one thing and you can use this code. And then everyone has certainty. Kyle, you want to use it, and then you go, oh, I want to share it with Hillary. Can I do that? Yes, because under the open source definition, you have the ability to copy it. You get that copyright license. You also have the ability to sub-license. And those, no matter what kind of flavor of open source license you're looking at, because there are many, and you can find them if you're interested on the Open Source Initiative website. There are many different flavors. They have different obligations, different focus. But at its core, it's that you get a copyright license and you get to give other people a copyright license. And that's how you get the success of the Linux kernel, which has, like 30 million lines of code, thousands of individual contributors every year. I think Google sent, submitted 20,000 commits to the Linux kernel in recent years. So, I mean, it's really, that kind of collaboration isn't possible when you have to go and negotiate every step of the way. So I don't take it personally as an attorney that people want fewer attorneys involved, because I mean, look at this. It's been able to facilitate some amazing things.
Definitely. Yeah. And so whether or not the language is readable or not, so the general idea is that it is usable. It's just how you use it is kind of the determining factor there then. So because there are certain licenses where if you make any modifications, you have to send them back upstream. You don't, but there are others where you don't have to.
Right. So the obligations really vary. So you can think of it different ways. The way that we usually think about it at Google, and this is something that we share in our open source documentation, because we can't give everyone legal advice, but we can share, this is kind of how we're thinking about it. And maybe that helps other people. And maybe if everyone does a better job of handling their code and meeting their obligations, that means that the whole, ecosystem is a little bit healthier and safer, and people can use each other's stuff better. So the way that we think about it is there are certain licenses that are extremely permissive, almost like public domain, where you can, just go ahead and do whatever. There are some licenses where you just have to share the notice text, the actual license text, in a human readable form. And depending on the product, that might actually be hard to do. So it's an important obligation that you have to meet. There are some licenses that are known as copyleft, where, depending on the license, there might be a different trigger for when you have to share what you've contributed or derivative works, or what you've combined it with. But licenses like the GPL, you want to be thinking about when you're sharing it. Are you combining it with something? Are you building on it? And you have to be sharing more of the code that you combine with it under the same terms. So that's what makes people a little freaked out. Like, what does this mean? Does all open source mean that you can't keep your code to yourself? And it's really more thinking through ahead of time. Like, what does that mean if you're going to use that code for free and you get the terms up front and you have to comply? What does it mean? And so you have to be prepared to think about the scope of what you will have to share when you're building on that code. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we have a lot of GPL and wonderful products. We have tons of Linux and Android and so on. We have GPL in a lot of places. We just have to think through in advance, how are we going to do this to make sure we're using it the right way?
Definitely. And so this, what we're talking about here. So as you mentioned, so just as a reminder to all of our viewers, we're not necessarily trying to dole out legal advice here, but just understanding of what how you can be impacted by different licenses, whether you're contributing, you're looking to create your own open source project, or if you happen to be working somewhere that wants to use open source and doesn't necessarily have the best understanding of how to use open source. And so that's where, like what Hillary was just mentioning, if whether you're contributing or wanting to integrate some open source project into yours, and this is where sub-licensing comes in and stuff like that, correct?
Yeah. I mean, so sub-licensing, that's where you want to make sure that other people are able to use it the same way. So Kyle, you build something really cool with let's make up a product. I think we're using a cool kind of Goose logo streaming thing. So, you create Open Goose, and then you created it. Then maybe Daniel is also working on it, and then I want to know if I can use it. And Daniel goes, oh, actually, this license says that you can sublicense it. So even though he's not the original author, he knows he can still share it with me. So that's kind of how that works. So that's one of those core things that you want to see in an open source license. So the buck doesn't stop with just the original author. It just, other people are able to continue. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Perfect. So I do see a couple questions coming in already, which is great. And as a reminder, you definitely drop your questions in the chat and we will try to get them featured here. I want to call out the first one that we have from D. Thompson Dev. What license would you recommend just for what license would you recommend just for an average community project where you would like others to contribute? Not really with the goal of monetizing it, but helping others. So this is, I assume we're looking at a project where you're just kicking it off and looking for other contributors for a open source greater good project.
Yeah. So, and again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm not here to give people legal advice on exactly how they should license their projects and so on. But I'll say just in terms of like best practices, this is what you want an open source license for. So the open source initiative has a list of OSI licenses that meet the definition. And so, you may not be, maybe you're not super comfortable picking out a license, but there are kind of some flavors. You can look at the top most popularly used licenses like the GPL, that copyleft one, the MIT, the BSD, the Apache, which happens to be Google's favorite open source license. But really, any of those will do what you want in terms of setting up those basic license permissions and making sure that other people can contribute to it. There can be nuances on top of that. If you want to have terms around how people contribute to the project, you might want to look at a contributor license agreement, and Google uses one of those. There are also different versions of that. You can look at the Apache Software Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation. They have their own CLAs. There are also developer certificate of origin. So you might want to think about both how you license the code and if you want special terms for people contributing to the project. But in general, really, it's up to you and it's up to the other people contributing to your project what you're trying to solve for and how you want to license it. So that's an important decision.
Definitely. And just to confirm, so the opensource.org/OSD is where they should go look to see what our that was the link we had up, this link that we're showing right now. So is that where they should go to look to see what
So it's going to be on the opensource.org website, and it's easy to poke around. It's pretty easy to navigate. There's the open source definition is at that OSD domain. But if you go to opensource.org/licenses/category, or you can sort them by name, whichever you want to do. Yeah, so there are a lot. So it might seem like there are a lot of open source licenses that are approved as meeting the open source definition. But the interesting kind of history here is that for a while, everyone in the world wanted to create their own niche open source license. And this seemed like a really fun thing to do. Or maybe it's kind of like this license, but then you work in something in there that's just, it seems really funny to you, right? And I can understand that. Sometimes I read these licenses and I do giggle a little bit, but then it's a little bit frustrating because when you get more and more variations of these licenses, that means you have to go through additional levels of review. So one license that, it's not a good open source license in my opinion, but there's a license called the beerware license. And I think it kind of shows how much strife it caused to have this term saying you can use this code, but buy the developer of beer. Like that seems really funny. Like I get it, but you can tell that it caused a lot of friction and that it freaked out a lot of people's attorneys and a lot of people who weren't sure if they could use it or how are we going to send a beer? Because then you get things like the beerware light where it's like, okay, this has really stressed people out. It's gotten less funny. So now we have to have a license that says you can use this code, but if you want to, you can buy the developer beer. And so these jokes start to get a little bit more strained as you have more and more levels of review. Anyway, that's kind of a niche, a silly niche. But basically with open source licenses, there was this trend of anything that you find funny, anything that you, any kind of restriction you want to impose on people, even if it doesn't meet the open source definition, because that's supposed to be permitting anyone, regardless of the type of work they're doing or who they are. It's supposed to not discriminate. So it's supposed to be that anyone can use it, and it maximizes that ability to collaborate. People started working in these bespoke terms that felt really satisfying, but then that means that you have so many different licenses out there. It's harder to have kind of that level of certainty about what the terms mean. So one thing that the open source initiative did over the years is they wound up having this kind of anti-proliferation project saying we really need to cut down on the number of licenses that are touting themselves as open source licenses or people are using as open source licenses, because this is causing a lot of confusion and kind of slowing things down. And you kind of find that there's a little bit more momentum and certainty when there's kind of a core set of licenses that are most commonly used that people understand. And I think especially considering the context of how international a lot of these collaborations are, the open source licenses are in English, but also there's a real range in whether people are represented by legal counsel. And so when you have tons of different licenses, I think it's a lot harder for people to be familiar with what the terms mean and know whether they're comfortable with those terms and obligations, versus if you're looking at kind of that core set of maybe 20 licenses. If people have been working in open source development for a while, they probably have some understanding of what the GPL or the LGPL, the MIT, what that means and what they need to do. So just it provides more certainty and makes things a little more efficient.
Definitely. So as you were talking about the beerware license, one of the licenses that I've seen more commonly is the coffeeware one, where buy me a coffee instead of buying the beer kind of thing. So the coffeeware one.
Yeah, no, that's out there. And I'm fine with, Jimmy Wales saying, if you want to read Wikipedia, why don't you pay for a few cups of coffee? And that's a little, easier in terms of it's not like you're infringing someone's copyright just by reading it and not sending them a coffee or, there's some fun stuff. There's also, this is diverging a little bit, but there's just some really silly stuff. Like anyone can use this license except if they wear a Che Guevara t-shirt. And that seems like funny to someone. It's kind of funny, but at the same time, it's like, you are going to have some attorneys somewhere who are very freaked out saying, I don't know if we can guarantee that nobody's going to wage, and it gets really abstract, but it's funny. And then it's kind of annoying. We'd like to have some certainty about, like, we don't have to spend so much time reviewing this every time that it shows up in someone else's, GitHub repo.
Definitely. So you did mention a public domain a little bit. Because public domain typically, at least in my mind, when I hear public domain, you're thinking of like artworks. So photographers that have, here's free photographs that you can use. Or when you look at the movie industry, movies that after so long fall into public domain. How is that in relation to open source, or how does it not relate to open source?
Absolutely, yeah, great question. So public domain. Speaking primarily of US law, but it is a concept in other copyright jurisdictions as well. In the US, usually it refers to works that are protected by copyright. And so, works that are protected by copyright can be any kind of a creative work. So that could be, film, music, photography. It can also be code. The bar for creativity is surprisingly low. So just so everyone is aware, code is typically protected by copyright as soon as it's written down. So any work that is protected by copyright that has fallen out of that term of that period of copyright protection. So it used to be a much shorter term. Now maybe it's the life of the author plus a number of decades, or maybe it is based on your employment under a corporate employer, and there's a copyright term for corporate copyright ownership. But basically, anything that is old enough to have fallen out of that term of copyright protection will be in the public domain. And I know the Internet Archive has a fun, public domain day celebration sometimes. But that's interesting. But most of the code that anybody is going to be interested in is not going to be in the public domain yet. It just has not been around that long. Even some punch card code will not be in the public domain. Okay, so that's one part of it. But the other part is that you can dedicate things to the public domain. And that can be a little bit trickier than people expect. But what that means is that you were saying, I I abandon copyright, or you can use this in any way. There are no obligations, and this is not protected by copyright. You can very clearly try to, and that's not advice on how to try to dedicate something to public domain, because again, it can be a tricky issue, and it really varies by country. So especially in Europe, there are countries where it's potentially almost impossible to dedicate things to the public domain. That's just not how their copyright regime works. So it's not always intuitive. So you see some interesting things like, and I think there is a lot of confusion between public domain and open source, where people feel like it's on the internet, people want other people to use it, so isn't it just public domain? And the difference is that with public domain, if something really is in the public domain, if somebody has successfully dedicated it to the public domain, then people can use it however they want. There's no restriction. I mean, maybe if it's something that is protected by patent law, that's going to be a separate issue. But at least in terms of copyright, they get to copy it and make derivative works that way without restrictions. And you don't even have to preserve the license text or anything like that. So because it can be really tricky to dedicate to the public domain, you do see some licenses. Creative Commons licenses aren't really written for code, but there are things like the CC0, where it says, it's trying to be a public domain dedication, but kind of acknowledging how hard that can be. There's a fallback license that's very permissive that says, if it's still protected by copyright, then you get this really, generous license. So you see stuff like that, and I think it's just a little bit tricky, because I think people understand that open source is supposed to facilitate collaboration, and some of the licenses are extremely permissive, but they're not necessarily public domain.
Gotcha. And so that would kind of fall into, because I remember as a software engineer, there was a whole thing that came up with Stack Overflow a few years ago, where if you're copying code from Stack Overflow, you have to provide the right attributions, stuff like that. So is that kind of what you're getting to? Getting into, where it's not necessarily public domain, but
yeah. So that is definitely a little different. And Stack Overflow is interesting. In I think it was it 2009, they added default terms to all of the content on their site as CC by SA. So it's not, in my opinion, because Creative Commons was not. They specifically said, we're writing these amazing licenses, but the way that copyright applies to code is not something that we want to get into here. So they wrote Creative Commons licenses not considering software. So I don't love Creative Commons licenses for software, mainly for that reason. It does still happen. There is code licensed under CC by SA and other Creative Commons licenses. So that is in the terms. There's been some discussion around applying an MIT license to Stack Overflow, but I don't think that was ever incorporated into their terms of service. So so far, yes, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out exactly the right way to attribute content from Stack Overflow, but the terms do fall under a license that requires attribution. So, you can always do things like, you don't have to be a lawyer to reach out and ask someone, how do you want to license this? Or, can I use your code? And if so, how do you want me to recognize you in a header or something like that? You can reach out and ask authors for clarity about how they're comfortable sharing their code, because that's really what open source licensing is about. And in terms of the public domain versus open source, I think sometimes people just aren't that familiar with open source licenses yet and are just getting into it. And other times, developers who share their code under open source licenses, that doesn't mean they don't care about their code or they don't care about copyright. A lot of the times they care a lot about the copyright license they've chosen and how they're comfortable with other people using it. So especially if you look at kind of those more free software type licenses or copyleft obligations in the GPL, let's say, the person who is licensing their code or project licensing their code that way might have very strong feelings that they're sharing this with the world, but they want to maximize the free access to software. And they want people, if they're going to build on GPL, they want people to share the maybe not improvements, but at least maybe in the subsequent user's mind improvements. They want that shared with the world under those same free permissions. So I think there's a bit of confusion that, oh, if somebody puts it under an open source license, they don't really care. And I work enough with open source developers to say, like, a lot of open source developers care a lot about, how they want to make sure that their name is still showing up in the headers. All these things that are very important to preserve when you're working in open source.
Definitely. Yeah. And that's very important. I've worked on and created some of my own, and yeah, it's kind of disheartening to see when your name is scrubbed, when somebody forks your repository and stuff like that. We do have some really good questions about public domain. The first one from Robert here. What is a standard non-commercial license? I guess is the first part of the question. And then, it is frowned upon, but one group member was non-commercial or nothing, and they wound up going with a CC by NC. Again, we're not giving legal advice here, but your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So, setting aside judgments, because I think it's not so much like, that we frown upon non-commercial or whatever. It's really that people can license their code, the code they've written, however they want. The reason why you don't really see open source licenses with non-commercial restrictions is because that doesn't meet the open source definition. So the open source definition came about, and I know I mentioned it's been around for 20 years, but actually even before the open source definition, there were the Debian free software guidelines. There was the free software movement. And open source really, from the get-go, had this idea of maximizing collaboration by permitting participation from commercial users, permitting commercial entities to use. So I think it's fair for people to have mixed feelings about, who do they want using their code. And Creative Commons licenses are not open source licenses, but they do have those different flavors. There's a non-commercial license there. Anything that is marked non-commercial is not actually going to be it's not going to be an open source license, because if you look at the definition, and that's that OSD link that we shared before, it says that you can't discriminate by fields of endeavor or purpose or who can use it. So working something in there saying that commercial entities can't use it goes against that. And we do see, a lot of the times we reach out to people who have shared their licenses under a non-commercial license just to find out what was intended there. Because we want to make sure that we're only using things where we're able to honor the license terms and able to honor what the licensor wants. But maybe if a university has put something under a non-commercial license, and then they ask, actually, you have some developers in this area that, we'd like to collaborate, and we go, oh, actually, we really can't play with that license. And it turns out they weren't actually thinking that they wouldn't be able to collaborate with these few cool Google developers that they actually like. They were thinking, well, we don't want some company doing X, Y, Z. So sometimes it's kind of getting to the bottom of, like, why is it that you want a non-commercial license? But if you are less interested in open source and more interested in non-commercial restriction, there's that Creative Commons license. You could also look at some of the licenses that are approved as free software licenses that may be outside that overlapping Venn diagram between open source and free software, where a lot of licenses meet both, but some of them are a little bit more prejudicial towards things like commercial use. So that might be of interest to you.
Yeah. And so, following up on that, so since we were talking about non-commercial, does obviously we kind of dove into that open source doesn't necessarily mean non-commercial. Can you still be making money off of your open source projects?
Yeah. So there are a lot of really interesting models. I mean, some of the things I could talk about are really Google specific probably, but there are a lot of different models for making money in open source. And some of them might be that you offer one version under an open source license and a different version under a paid license. Some of them it's, that you are providing open source software, but that you'll provide a certain commitment to support for a paid license. So I think a couple weeks ago, when Dan and Anne were talking about open source security, there is an interesting thing where so much open source software is really critical at this point and relied upon by so many people. But that doesn't mean that everyone who shares code under an open source license is ready to take on the responsibility for, 27 companies sending them commits with, sending them pull requests with requests to fix vulnerabilities and so on. Maybe it was just a hobby project that they started working on that happened to work really well. So you'll definitely see things where it's like maybe you can have this open source software, but if you want a certain level of support and customization, then you can get paid access, that kind of thing. That's a model that we're seeing a lot of. There are also a lot of companies that will bundle together open source software, and that's okay because open source permits commercial use, but maybe they'll bundle together a number of different open source projects, and the way that they write a custom wrapper to bring it all together, that liability and being able to share a product more widely. And then obviously Google has ads revenue and so on. But, I think there are different ways of looking at success with open source. And sometimes as an individual, maybe you're thinking about getting your name out there, getting more experience, building your resume. We've definitely hired a lot of people based on their work in open source, a lot. And then for IDE or, there are all these different things where sometimes there's an open source portion and then there's something else that works well with it. That it's all kind of an experiment right now. And I think there's some interesting groups looking at different ways to compensate, especially independent open source developers as well. So there's
definitely.
Anyway,
I was gonna add on. So like as you were mentioning with Android, we've seen it grow from just a phone operating system to where it's running on our watches, in our cars, on various other devices. And so where it started out from and where it is now is kind of the possibilities with your library might not have necessarily been the initial thought, but the project grew to that point. And then since we were talking about other Google open source licenses, one that I'm familiar with is Angular. Angular is open source, and I've seen lots of other interesting things paid and continuing on the free licensing on improvements to the Angular framework. So that way, it's other add-ons to the CLI, or it's integrating in different UI libraries and stuff like that, easy ways to beef up your Angular project. So yes, let's continue to add. These are some great questions that we have coming in here. We do have another one from Robert on in relation to public domain. So what are your thoughts on BSD 0 for public domain? I don't have much familiarity with this one, so I'm very interested to learn about that.
So I actually, it's interesting because there are a number of public domain dedications or attempted public domain dedications with fallback licenses that have a 0 in it. So BSD 0 is kind of this funny license in that from the title, and because it's extremely permissive, it seems like it's a public domain dedication, but it's really more of an extremely permissive license. So it's kind of a funny one, but I'm never opposed to a very permissive license. I like things that are easy to use. If you say you get to do all the fun things with this code, then that sounds great to me. It's maybe not quite a public domain dedication, but maybe that works just fine for people living in countries where it's hard to dedicate to the public domain anyway. So those are my thoughts.
Gotcha. Awesome. Thanks. Cool. So, one of the things that we also wanted to chat about, so these are kind of what we've been talking about thus far is, how do we contribute, or if we want to use open source, what are some benefits of open sourcing a project that you've been working on? So I know we had a question a little bit earlier that they want to start a project, but if you've been working on something, what is the benefit of open sourcing it?
Oh yeah, gosh, there are so many. So it depends what kind of a perspective you're coming from, right? So I'm thinking there's individual developer, there's maybe small project, there's maybe small company, and then there's mega companies like Google. So if you're thinking as an individual developer, I took a bootcamp coding course a while ago, and I think a lot of people are very interested in building up their portfolio, getting their name out there, making sure that they have something to show recruiters, building their skills. A lot of the times just getting out there in open source, putting out contributions and showing how good you are at making things is going to be a great way to build your brand. And even in the small amount of litigation that's happened in open source with actual published case law, courts have recognized that there's a tangible benefit to having code out there, even permissively licensed, with your name on it in terms of like building your credibility and building your brand and kind of marketing yourself as a developer. So that's one thing. Then, I think for anyone at any scale, sharing code is a great way to draw on expertise that is out there in the wild, and Google has a lot of talented developers. We don't have every talented developer. There are incredibly talented people all over the world working on cool things. And a lot of open source developers are extremely passionate and work on it projects in their night after hours and weekends. And they're contributing things just because they care a lot and they have a lot of passion and expertise. So when you share something as open source and you allow the rest of the world to contribute, I mean, maybe that really strange niche in 3D printing, that niche, there's a certain number of people who are very excited about that. And when you share something as open source, then people who are interested in that are able to find it and contribute to it. And then it can grow based on the collective expertise. So that's one thing. There are also a lot of different goals that you can meet through open sourcing. And this isn't legal advice. This is just kind of strategy. But one thing is that it's a great way to promote your company. If you're sharing things as open source, people are able to actually look at the code, see what it is, and go, oh, this is really good stuff. Like these developers at this company know what they're doing. A lot of people care a lot about being able to inspect what they're consuming. So kind of, the software equivalent of being a person who goes to the restaurant and likes to see people cooking, likes to know where the ingredients came from. I mean, there are people who are really passionate and want to know what's in that software, and they want to be able to inspect it. So, you're putting it out there, you're able to build, and you're able to get all of those commits back. So I won't cover the same security topics that were covered a couple of weeks ago, but there's also that concept of having many eyes on the code, many people resolving any kind of bugs or vulnerabilities, and you're able to kind of crowdsource more talent and figure out how to triage and make sure that the right protections are in place. But really having more people working on that and spotting what's going wrong can make code a lot better, a lot more secure. And then there are also goals around adoption. So, thinking specifically of Google, we've talked about Android. There are projects like TensorFlow, where the fact that we open sourced it, instead of just saying the rest of the world can use something else and we're going to use something special and keep it to ourselves, we share it with the world, at least for some of our projects, some of these huge open source projects that we've shared. Then we get to benefit from all of the academic research that's going on that may look at our code rather than some other technological standard, because we've shared it, right? And other people can research it and develop it and make it better. And we benefit from figuring out what adoption would look like in different areas. So it's a topic that I could talk about for a very long time, myself off. But in terms of really testing out, how it works in so many different ways, you get this whole new power from sharing it with the world and seeing if the rest of the world wants to use it.
Definitely. And I want to make a nod back to something you mentioned earlier too, where there are some cases where in contributing to Google's open source libraries, we have made hires from that as well. So whether if your company is looking to hire some excellent engineers, stuff like that, you look at those that are contributing to your open source, or consider open sourcing part of your thing, that your project, that might be able to find some great engineers through as well. So I think that's another great, since the question was, why should I make it open source? I mean, finding new talent is another reason for that too. Beyond, I really love the restaurant analogy there too, where because like as you were explaining that, I was picturing myself in a sushi restaurant, because I mean that's one of the things when you sit up at the sushi bar, you get to watch them do all the different rolls, whether it's your order or not. You get to see how these things are made, and that's one of the exciting things about working in code, being a software engineer. Kind of looking under the hood, how does this actually run? Because most users of software, like in this YouTube frame that everybody's watching us in, nobody really understands. Unless you get to look under the hood and see what's running underneath here. And so that's some of the fun, exciting things.
Yeah.
You have a couple questions that also popped in here. We did have another one here from Robert around, from what he's heard was BSD 0 was better for international use because, as you were alluding to earlier, public domain really isn't a thing everywhere. So
yeah, and I think we kind of got there. So Robert and I, are kind of thinking about this in the same way. But yeah, it all depends what the goals are. Not everyone can share to the public domain, but it depends. If you want to be really permissive, then take a look. You can look at the open source initiative. They categorize by license type. Check out the really permissive ones, and it might be easier to share that way.
Definitely. And I want to welcome Eddie here. So Eddie, I always hire for my clients the contributors to their open source projects. So like right there is another real world example of kind of what we were just chatting about. So that's awesome and a great way to continue the working in open source and contributing or as a company open sourcing your stuff out there.
Yeah.
One of the other questions we did, you and I were talking a little bit before we hopped on the show here, and because one of the concerns that we've heard from developers was sometimes the company that they work for is, we're talking like enterprise level, mid-size. These companies don't necessarily understand all of the different open source licenses. How and can they use open source in their custom enterprise projects that they're working on?
Yeah, I mean, far be it for me to give legal advice that contradicts their own attorneys, right? So not going there, but I think it's an interesting time where a lot of companies that have traditionally been very against open source, like very wary, very much of the mindset that if you have code, you have to keep it secret from absolutely everyone, and you can't trust any other code. They're starting to come around a little bit, and I'm thinking about, without naming names, there are companies that are more traditional hardware companies, let's say, and they've generally been all about you keep that IP as secret as possible. And I think that they're coming around a little bit more to the idea of there are tools, there are things that they want to use that open source software developers have written that have already been built on and tested and improved upon and adopted as market standard that might be better than what they can just create in-house. And that a lot of the times engineers, not that all engineers switch jobs every year or two, but there's a lot of movement around Silicon Valley, right? And people are not always excited to move and work on the exact same thing that they worked on at the last company. So a lot of the times it improves employee satisfaction. It's more efficient. You can get better technology by using open source. So a lot of companies that used to be opposed to using open source are getting more comfortable with it. Then it's kind of a different step trying to get companies comfortable with their employees sharing back to open source. And I think that's still just a process. And I can't always fix that for other companies. So we have there's the Open Source Program Office has a patching policy. And most of it is public. So if people look that up, they can see, generally it's kind of, if people are following best practices on GitHub and securing their accounts and, registering it internally anyway, then they can go ahead. And if it's a license that we use, then a lot of the times Googlers can go ahead and patch it. Not every company is that permissive. A lot of companies have attorneys who want to be involved in looking at everything that goes out the door. And so that's something that is really going to depend on what your employer is comfortable with if you want to stay on good attorneys, I guess. So it's kind of a cultural thing in terms of companies figuring out what the benefits are to using open source. And I think, I feel very lucky being at Google, thinking about the long term in terms of how much it benefits us to have Googlers improving external open source. I mean, if we are using a project and it turns out to have vulnerabilities, we fix the version that is internal, then great. But also, what about when the project updates to a new version? Then do we have to re-implement all those changes again? Nobody really wants to do that. And also, does that leave the rest of the internet being more vulnerable because we didn't share those changes back? So we really take a more kind of long-term stance in terms of, we will fix it internally, but we want the main project to be better as well. We want to contribute back. And I think we care a lot about that ecosystem and maintaining the long-term health and strength of those open source projects.
Yeah, and partly that question was coming from some of my personal background, where a previous employer, we essentially had to reinvent the wheel every single time we wanted to do anything, like our own user authentication, our own, basically everything.
Yeah.
If there was a JavaScript library out there for it, we couldn't use it.
Yeah.
And I mean, eventually there started to be progress made and stuff like that, but it was just one of those interesting things. And there, as you mentioned, there are still companies out there that are slowly advancing. You
Yeah.
did kind of hint on hardware a little bit, and so it reminded me there was the LG, when they came out with the LG G5, their phone, they released a whole hardware, open source hardware, like, hey, other companies, other developers, make some add-ons for this phone, and they came out with a couple different examples of
Yeah.
what you could do with their phone. So, and that's essentially what you were kind of alluding to. And we have a question from Akshu, who kind of relates to this. So, a little bit more. How do these licenses with hardware designs? Are there any complications, restrictions, and I assume in regards to these open source software licenses?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think open hardware is a really interesting area right now. I think a lot of the traditional focus for hardware has been patents rather than copyright. And there are licenses that open source licenses that touch on patents. Not all of them do, or some of them have implied patent licenses, like saying you can use this, but it's not a really clear patent license. And so when you're thinking about copyright and patent, I mentioned that copyright protects creative expression, tangible creative expression. So that can be software that's written down, even if it doesn't seem super creative, as long as there's some kind of decisions. Anyway, without getting into all that, patent law protects useful inventions. So a lot of the times that's the main focus with hardware. So it can be a little bit tricky, and a lot of the open source licenses are written specifically thinking about software. So certain licenses have a very broad definition of the work that's being licensed. And so you do see Apache, even though it was written primarily as a software license, you do see it being used to license data, to license hardware. And a lot of the times it comes down to what the licensor wants. So if the licensor has chosen to license it under those terms and it's clear that those are the permissions they want to give, then that's fine. I think another interesting thing with hardware is that there are the levels of copyrightability, or maybe just patent protectable. When you get to hardware designs or human readable hardware description languages, those kinds of things are potentially more like code, where there might be a practical element. When you get closer and closer to the actual physical hardware itself, then it maybe is more just the world of patents. Maybe there isn't a copyright creative expression there that you're protecting. So you have to look at, in the hardware space, what it is you're trying to license. If it's Verilog and it's a hardware description language thing, then maybe you can license it under an open source license, and that will give people the copyright permissions that they want. But I think it's interesting. There are places you can look, like the CHIPS Alliance, like, we work on OpenTitan with low risk. There's also the OSHWA, the open source hardware group, trying to look at, what would the open source definition look like for hardware? And, looking at a lot of kind of tinkering spaces as well, in terms of, maker labs and just building cool things, and thinking about how do we translate what's worked so well for open source software into collaborations in hardware. So it's a big question depending on what we're looking at. But
right, and I think that's where we're kind of, and I'm kind of watching the chat here a little bit too, and so I guess that kind of leans into more, you're creating something using like Arduino, Raspberry Pi, or like the Coral boards that we offer. You like, these are boards that you purchase that have their own patents and have their own design schematics and all of that, but you're writing software that runs on these. So
yeah.
I think that's where this question is
Yes.
further going into,
Yeah.
in the
firmware.
IoT space and stuff.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah. And I think, it's always good to have guidance from your patent legal as well, in terms of like, what does this mean? What are we sharing? Are we ready to share it yet? That type of thing. So, tread carefully, but where the patents are really, critical. But I think really you want to be thinking about, is it something where people need copyright permissions? And if so, then I think a lot of the open source licenses can translate. They just might be drafted a little bit more focused on software. But if it's kind of sort of like software, then that's something. And you see definitely a lot of GPL and LGPL in like the Arduino and kind of firmware spaces. So definitely open source licenses are present in all of that, and you want to make sure you have those permissions. But I just try to be careful around hardware because sometimes it's a really critical space for patents. If you just want to share things and that's all that matters to you, and you don't have a corporate employer, being very protective of its patents, or not even just corporate employer, really universities are extremely protective, right? So if you're a researcher, then you're going to have to probably talk to your university about what you're able to share and how. And it might get very complicated. So it's sometimes not just open source licenses, like for Chips Alliance, even the actual spec development involves an additional patent terms. Anyway, I could go on for a long time.
Well, that's great. So this one does switch gears a little bit, and I think this is an excellent question. I love how this is phrased. So from Arvine, working in a team in open source is still challenging for a lot of new devs. What is your advice and tips for how developers can work in open source?
Yeah, I mean, this is something where it would be great to have Arvind like on the call, because I'd want to hear like what's the challenge. Is it the functional, like the GitHub collaboration of having other people review pull requests and all collaborating at the same time, or kind of what the challenge is here? Because I can talk about licensing all day, every day, but it's good to know kind of like what's the most difficult thing here.
Feel free to drop some more follow-ups in
definitely drop some more follow-ups. But we do hear a lot of things. Sometimes it's even just the figuring out what the project culture is. Maybe if you're thinking about certain programming languages, there's already this hardcore group of main project maintainers that have a very set way of working, and they like to do things their way. And that can be a little bit rigid sometimes, or maybe there's a code of conduct and people are trying to figure out what does that mean, and try and treat people decently, and and write good software. That's all.
Yeah, and I assume part of this is still how I interpreted this question too was change coming from let's say I'm an engineer coming from a very corporate background on how I'm building software, moving to the open source space. How do you help encourage new developers to change that gear in their head? Like the code that we're doing is for good, it's open. We're not necessarily looking to 100% monetize everything. We're not necessarily looking at these particular business goals on generating this much revenue or ROI from the software. So that's how I interpreted this question.
Yeah, I mean, it could be all kinds of things. And I guess when you're sharing something as open source, I think sometimes what can be a little bit different is sometimes it means sharing things when they're still a little bit raw as well, right? If people are collaborating out in the open on GitHub rather than running it internally and using their usual testing and whatever, that means that random people are going to give you feedback. And that's part of what makes open source code stronger, is that you have more people looking at it and picking at it. But I think maybe if you're not expecting the entire internet to pile on and start picking at it and saying, actually, I think it should be written this way, you probably will have to deal with some people's very strong opinions on how they think code should be written.
Definitely. And I think there's a great follow-up to that from Eddie here. How can you help decision makers understand the benefits of open source?
That, again, could mean so many things. I mean, I'm thinking immediately of this as, decision makers at large companies and whether to use open source. And I could talk about that for another hour, not to give Kyle a heart attack. I promise I won't go on for too long. But in terms of using open source, a lot of the times the best solution that's on the market in a particular niche, a lot of the times it's an open source one. And I think we've talked about things like the Linux kernel, but there are a lot of different, security and encryption tools, a lot of testing tools, where the code that has had the most hours of development expertise poured into it is the open source version, with developers all over the world working on it and fixing it. There are some open source packages that are kind of neglected, that are just left out, left out in the sun, and just nobody's maintaining it. But a lot of the times there are open source solutions that are better than anything that you're really going to pay for. And there, I think the economics of, there is an open source version that the entire world relies on, that's the gold standard for this kind of technology. Or instead of using that for free, you could say, I don't trust it, I'm going to pay someone to write it in-house. And then you just have 1 or 2 developers working on it, and you're paying them a full-time salary to do something that's already been built. I think the economics there are pretty compelling, right? And just speaking from the Google point of view, not to be crass, but we all know that Google makes a lot of money, and well over half of our code base is open source. And we share a lot of open source, but we're also one of the largest users of open source, and it's worked out very well for us. So, to me, it kind of sells itself in terms of you have to be able to comply with those licenses. You really need to be giving back to open source and improving it, and making sure that the open source ecosystem is healthy and supported, and that those critical packages are maintained. But, the economics are pretty clear, that if you're not being charged for it, and that's the best thing that you can be using, why wouldn't you use it? It's kind of, that's...
Licenses aside, of course.
Yeah, as long as you're able to comply with licenses, right?
Yes, definitely. And so which kind of leans into, I know we're coming up on time here, and so I just kind of want to run through one final question here. We've talked about the different benefits of open source licenses, how to contribute, which licenses, what, if we're looking at them, how there's as we're talking about, like a copy left, or all these different things to be mindful of when we're working with licenses. One of the things that we haven't chatted about yet is, are these licenses even enforceable? Like how can us, as because you were mentioning earlier that sometimes developers, their names get wiped off the project when it gets integrated into something else. So how is this enforceable?
Yeah. So without giving everyone instructions on like a how to sue everyone, because there can be downsides to that as well. And I think a lot of the times pulling a Leroy Jenkins and running in and threatening to sue everyone is not really the best way to collaborate. But in terms of legal enforceability, at least in US case law, and there is a fair amount of case law in other countries as well, but obviously I'm based in the US, but there is case law on interpreting whether an open source license is enforceable. And I think if you look at the open source casebook that we have on GitHub, and I think that's in the links that this program is sharing.
Yeah, we'll get that up here in a second.
That there is case law around open source licenses functioning as enforceable contracts. And so the case that I'm thinking of was specifically looking at the artistic license, but that is one of the open source licenses with obligations to maintain the license text and to maintain that information that people apply in file headers saying, copyright Kyle 2021, that downstream maintainers have to retain that. And that it's not a trivial obligation. It's something that does bring economic benefit in terms of reputational benefits, in terms of recognition and building your portfolio as a developer. And that it's something that is a clear condition. So these open source licenses give copyright permissions, but the licenses that have conditions that say, you can use this if you do this, that forms a binding contract, where under US contract law, there has to be an element of mutuality. The legal term is consideration, where there has to be some sort of an exchange where you get something in exchange for this. So what I get on this side of the bargain is I get permission to copy, use, modify, do all the fun stuff. And what you get is you get your name staying on this code. So that is a binding contract at that point, where I know that I'm able to have these permissions, but I have to do the one thing that I have to do this one thing and you can use this code, right? I have to perform my part of the bargain and I have to use this. So that element of mutuality of legal consideration means that it is a legal document. So that is something that has an enforceable power.
Awesome. But yeah, that's great to hear. And so the link that we were just sharing, and it's also in the chat, is where to learn about more of this from Google's perspective and how we've been involved. Correct?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's not just learning about it from Google's perspective. It's just kind of saying, if you want to learn more about this kind of subject matter, like let's say there's a chapter about remedies and whether open source licenses are, functioning as just a mere IP license or as a contract law thing, and whether it's kind of copyright remedies or contract remedies that would apply. So if people really want to dive deep into these topics, sort of like when you're in law school, you just read cases all day. You can read it yourself. It's not legal advice. It's just, here, if you want to start thinking about these topics, you can read what some courts have said in open source or open source adjacent areas. Anyway, yeah, hopefully
Awesome.
it'll be interesting for some.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing all of these wonderful links to learn more about open source. And I know I learned a lot. So, not to keep you any longer, because I know we're kind of in the middle of the day and we have other meetings to get to. So
yeah,
I want
to
thank
silence notifications, but
yeah. Yes, all of my things were silenced as well. But I just want to say, well, that's it for this month's episode of Between the Brackets. I hope all of you enjoyed learning this much about open source licensing, how to use them, how they apply, how can we enforce them. There's a lot of exciting information. I really enjoyed it. So thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Hillary, for joining me today. And then I also want to thank Daniel and Medusha backstage that were helping run the show, clicking on all the buttons. And so just join us again next time as we dive into beyond DevDocs and explore fun and niche topics with the experts. And make sure you subscribe and also register to learn more for our upcoming episodes, as well as see our past episodes as well. And that you can find that at goo.gle/between the brackets. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you so much, Hillary.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.